Okay, calm down.
Yeah, speaking of war crimes, you had a piece that you just wrote about the cluster munitions and the hypocrisy in the United States giving Ukraine cluster munitions. Can you expand on this?
Yeah, I spent a fair amount of time working on this book, researching and then writing about cluster munitions. And I have several pages in the book about them. The United States has a history of using cluster munitions. And like Russia and Ukraine, the US has never signed the international treaty banning them that's been ratified by more than 130 countries. Actually, the bombing of Yugoslavia that not only Thomas Friedman, but essentially the vast majority of corporate media were so fond of, included use of cluster munitions. And I quoted one journalistic account, which didn't get much travel in the US. In Nice, on an afternoon, people went shopping at the farmer's market, and then the cluster munitions hit, and a woman is found dead clutching her carrots in a pool of blood. This is what cluster munitions are. They're according to really humane observers, neutral observers, one of the most horrific weapons of modern warfare, which is saying something. These thousands and thousands of so-called bomblets that explode, go horizontally, send shrapnel into what the industry calls soft targets, which is to say human beings. And so in the book, I write about how the US then proceeded to use cluster munitions with the 2001 invasion of Afghanistan. And then when the invasion of Iraq happened in 2003, the United States used, according to the Congressional Research Service, which I quote in this book, the US used between 1.8 and 2 million bomblets, these shards, these named bomblets, but shards of shrapnel, 2 million of them essentially in the first 3 weeks of the invasion of Iraq. Fast forward to about 18 months ago, when the horrible, and I think indefensible, we can explain why it happened, but it's not justifiable, when Russia did its invasion of Ukraine and has continued to make war on that country, the US news media and the White House quite properly condemned the use of cluster munitions. And there were all sorts of front page and other moralistic rhapsodies about how terrible these cluster munitions were that Russians were using. And they were and are really terrible. So you go from early last year to a few weeks ago, and wouldn't you know it, suddenly cluster munitions in the hands of the righteous, which is to say, the United States government handing over to the Ukrainian military, they aren't bad weapons. Actually, they're good weapons. This is really a exercise, and there's tremendous quantities of them, exercise in Orwellian pseudo-thinking, doublethink. And yet, for most of the news media, making that tie, pointing out the hypocrisy, is really not considered in US media to be among their missions.
Right. And I pointed this out with Medea Benjamin, but on one of the other shows that I do, Useful Idiots with Aaron Mate, where we show the Sunday morning news shows, you had a Ukrainian ambassador being interviewed by Margaret Brennan on Face the Nation. She was asked about these cluster munitions, and she was like, Margaret Brennan said, Russia uses them against civilians. I have to assume you won't be using them on civilians. And the Ukrainian ambassador's like, of course not.
Oh, that's craziness. It's just insane. Of course, that's the nature of those weapons, is that they kill a lot of civilians. With the New York Times and other outlets forthrightly reported 18 months ago when the news broke that Russians were doing it. I think, Katie, it's really revealing as well what the explanations were for why the United States would ship these previously denounced weapons to Ukraine. Back the middle of May, the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee, Adam Smith, who until this year was chair of the Armed Services Committee, gave a speech to that august body, the Center on Foreign Relations, Committee on Foreign Relations, CFR. And he brought up this idea he was asked about cluster munitions and he said, well, I'm open to it. Well, this was sort of should have been news. And I wrote about it in a piece for The Hill. Why did he say it would be perhaps necessary to ship cluster munitions to Ukraine? Well, he said Ukraine is running out of other weapons, other armaments. And the United States has an overflow supply of cluster munitions. So we really ought to look at the fact that we want Ukraine to win. They don't have enough weaponry. We're at full speed, full tilt, trying to manufacture as many as we can. So are other NATO countries, but we're not able to keep up. So the unthinkable has become thinkable and then become, we think, actually really wise to unload this huge quantity of stockpiled cluster munitions and send them to Ukraine. Well, several weeks after that talk by Adam Smith to CFR, the White House gradually warmed further to the idea and then, of course, announced that the shipments of cluster munitions would take place to Ukraine. One of the fascinating aspects and really dire and really outrageous factors here, which I haven't seen in mass media, is that the same rationale that the White House and the punditocracy has tried to excuse for shipping these weapons, these horrible weapons to Ukraine, the same rationale could be used for shipping and using tactical nuclear weapons. It's part of Russian and US military doctrine very openly that if you're losing a conventional war, you retain the option to start using nuclear weapons. So it's sort of a prototype. We're losing, we might have to make the unthinkable thinkable.